This is FE Peer Review. The date is still March the 8th, 2025. Thoughts on Culture Catz's conversation with Pastor Will Duffy. As some of you know, I am prone to leaving long comments on other people's videos. I suspect very few people ever read these comments, and even fewer who make it to the finish. But once in a while, I like to just take those comments and make a quick video of my own so that I can at least get my thoughts out there. For some reason, I have this compulsive urge to share my thoughts once in a while. So that's what I'm doing now. So Culture Catz put out a video today, a live stream, in which he was basically just having a great conversation with Will Duffy of TFE fame. And I really enjoyed it all the way through. It was personal, it was general, it covered a lot of topics. Towards the end, there was a kind of question and answer period where people had sent in questions, and people wanted to get Will to talk a little bit about his own views on other subjects that were based on his religious background. He's often described as a creationist. He's not inclined to want to go into a whole lot of detail about that because I gather he doesn't feel that's the purpose of what he's trying to put his energy into right now. I totally respect that. That's his choice. But he was gracious enough to try to answer some of these questions and share some thoughts. And in the process of the entire video, the entire conversation, I had plenty of thoughts of my own, as you can see from that wall of words. I'm not going to force you to read all that tiny print. I am going to read it myself and force you to listen to me drone on and on. But to make your life a little bit easier, I've copied it in larger text onto a few slides here, and I'll be reading from these slides. You can turn off the volume and just read it yourself if you're tired of hearing my voice. So here goes. And oh, by the way, I've put the timestamps. I've listed the timestamps. These are the timestamps to Catz's video. And I'm not going to play the irrelevant parts from his video. So if you want the context, you're going to need to go to his video. Hopefully, most of you have already seen it. And the ideas will anyway already be a little bit fresher in your minds. Okay, 7:45. This was Will Duffy talking. I knew that when we started hanging out together, eating at restaurants together, he was referring to himself and the other people that joined him on the trip to Antarctica at the beginning of the trip. And he was talking about how they were trying to like build up a little bit of camaraderie and get the conversation between everybody to be not so confrontational and all that. So he says, eating at restaurants together. My thoughts. This brings to mind something that I've been thinking about a lot since TFE. It's about the nature of trust, who we trust, why we trust, when our distrust is unfounded, etc. Most of the conspiracies surrounding Flat Earth are built on a foundation of distrust of individuals and institutions. When Jaron first announced his change in view, I pointed out that he accepted the evidence he saw himself, but never acknowledged that the thousands of people who came before him with the same evidence, people he distrusted for some reason, were actually trustworthy. His distrust was incorrect, not based in evidence. At the time, that was last January, he still wouldn't acknowledge that his distrust was unfounded when I asked him about it. For the record, his views may have changed at this point. I haven't followed him closely. Let's move on to the next. But eating at a restaurant together brings up the idea again. I'm sure most of these flat earthers have no issue with eating at a restaurant. And yet, what are they doing? They are trusting their very lives to the people preparing that food. Food poisoning can kill. Why? Why do they blindly trust that the normal restaurant is a reliable, safe place to eat? Have they stopped to think about it? One reason is because we have laws and inspection processes that enforce food safety regulations. The risks to the restaurants are too great, so they obey. This is not the case in countries with lax laws and enforcement. Well, we also have laws and enforcement procedures in the world of science. Engage in medical malpractice and you lose your license. If you're a research scientist and you engage in plagiarism, falsification of data, etc., you can lose your entire livelihood and reputation, if not more. So although it's my belief most people by nature try to act ethically most of the time, and most people can naturally be trusted most of the time, we as a society have built up all kinds of structures to make sure that we don't have to rely on each other's goodwill. Moving on, somebody asked Pastor Duffy about pineapple on pizza. He disapproved. I responded, I'm a hardcore atheist and I agree with Pastor Duffy on this point. Absolutely no pineapple on pizza. Then he and Catz were talking about the various people who refused to go to TFE, who refused to go to Antarctica, who were invited. And if any one of those could have, if he could have, of all those who refused, which one would he most like to have gone on the trip? And he responded, Eric Dubé. So I wrote, let's also keep in mind that Eric Hitler apologist Dubé was also one of the big voices describing Antarctica as off limits. He's gone very quiet about that recently. They had been talking about that Eric Dubé is now saying, oh yeah, 24-hour sun in Antarctica, no problem at all. And how these guys have changed their tune since this whole thing happened. And as far as the parentheses there, yes, that's correct. And if anybody wants to know more, go to Google and do a search, Eric Dubé WordPress, WORDPRESS. It will bring up his blog, and you'll find everything you need to know about him right there. Then somebody was talking about, what's the basis for thinking that the Bible is supportive of flat Earth? Will Duffy, being a Christian and a pastor and not a flat earther, they're asking him, what's going on here? How come these flat earthers point to the Bible? I'm gonna add here that it's predominantly the Old Testament people are talking about. When people point to the New Testament, it's the references in the New Testament to the Old Testament that are relevant. So a bit of context to keep in mind. The Old Testament was written at a time around 500 to 800 BCE, when most of the people in that region assumed the earth was flat. So it was written within that cultural context. It wasn't really even a question in people's minds what the shape was. Consequently, there are underlying assumptions in parts of the text which can easily be overstated to support a flat earth position. We're talking about a time before the ancient Greeks had begun to make their breakthroughs. So, it's to be expected that bits and pieces of the Old Testament may kind of sound flat earth-ish. That's pretty much where everybody was at that point in time. I can't see anybody, including most Christians, having a problem with this, and most Christians don't have a problem with it. I think that the only people that probably really struggle with that are those that see the Bible as the inerrant, inspired Word of God to be taken every comma and period absolutely literally, which is, pretty much impossible to do. That kind of narrow, super narrow mind is the only kind that can really end up going down that rabbit hole. So let's not belittle a 800 BCE text for, not providing us with the scientific breakthroughs that weren't even to begin to come until hundreds of years later. Okay, moving on. Can we crowdfund a trip to Antarctica for Dean Odell, and he can bring an exorcist along with him? Then they can try exorcising Satan from the sky as he circles around them. Dean Odell has suggested that perhaps the sun that they saw down there was actually Satan, for those who haven't caught that. Seems like a good exorcist is needed. Onward. Will Duffy was starting to talk about his belief in a young Earth. He didn't get into detail. He wasn't talking time frames. He wasn't inclined to talk about that kind of stuff, which is fine. But he said a little bit about the issue of time in general that I felt compelled to respond to. He was talking about how when you talk about the flat Earth, you're talking about the world now, what we are all on. So when he went down to Antarctica with some flat earthers, they're standing on the same world now, and they're talking about this world now. Is it flat or is it a sphere? When he's talking about young Earth stuff and old Earth stuff, we're not talking about the present. We're talking about the past. And that is an entirely different context. It creates a whole different framework for the discussion. This is my response to that. Time is a continuum. Duffy's line between the past and the present doesn't exist. Within our own lifetimes, there is a personal knowledge of changes with the passage of time. Within the time frame of written history, there is a continuum of written knowledge. It overlaps with the personal time frame. We can add other time continuums that also overlap, such as time measurement using dendrochronology. This measurement can be confirmed as reliable due to its matching of what we can confirm through the cultural time frame. Ditto with carbon-14 dating for the next step back in time, and so forth. Our systems for identifying and measuring the passage of time and the associated changes are indeed accurate. Creationism can only stand if these systems can be shown to be false, but creationists have never shown them to be false, and they have worked well. These systems have worked well time and time again. I'll add, that's not for trying. Creationists have tried a lot to debunk the various dating methods with no success. Getting near the end here, not too many more minutes of this. 59:45, to Pastor Duffy. He has, by the way, spoken with Aaron Ra in the past. Aaron Ra has produced a lot of material on his channel regarding things like transitional species and the flood. I encourage you to explore as much of that material as your time and interest allows, and then after that, have another conversation with him. It sounds to me like that earlier conversation of yours was not as productive as it could have been. Duffy talked about the research he does into the person he's going to be debating before he does a debate. I think a public conversation with Aaron Ra, not a debate, a public conversation with Aaron Ra would be really interesting. And if he were to do such a conversation, I would request that he do the same kind of research that he does before a debate, and look into Aaron Ra's work on his channel regarding these kinds of subjects. To me, one of the clear there are many, but I'm just going to focus on one. To me, one of the clear counter arguments against a flood depends on one point, which is when this flood happened. Typically, creationists put it at roughly 4,500 years ago, plus or minus a few hundred years. Apparently, that's where it fits within the timelines of the stories on either side of it in the Old Testament. So, with that as a given, that would place it at the height of major civilizations, the Sumerians, the Akkadians, the first through sixth dynasties of ancient Egypt, the earliest Chinese emperors, and more, who left lots of archaeological evidence, physical evidence, showing that they existed continuously through that period with no catastrophic interruptions. Of course, if someone places the date of the flood at a completely different time, say a few thousand years earlier, that's a different discussion. We're into prehistory, and the continuous detailed archaeological record is much more scarce. Don't give up. We're on the last page here. So one of the conversations that happened towards the end of the video was about uniformitarianism. Will Duffy was saying that in talking with people who were not young Earth creationists, some had referred to this concept of uniformitarianism, and he disagreed that that was entirely, necessarily relevant to the discussion. I wanted to chime in because I don't think his understanding of uniformitarianism is totally accurate or substantial enough. Conceptually, it is similar to Occam's razor. It is built on a premise that natural forces have always acted in the past as we observe them to act in the present. So if we propose a hypothesis for some observed natural phenomenon that depends on natural forces having acted differently in the past, we are adding an additional level of uncertainty and unexplained complexity to our hypothesis. That doesn't mean the hypothesis is wrong. But if some other hypothesis can explain what we observe without that added uncertainty and complexity, that second hypothesis is a better one to pursue further. An example of this with respect to the flood. Erica from the Gutsick Gibbon channel has shown how ideas proposed by some creationists regarding geological events they claim occurred during the flood would have required so much energy that the entire Earth would have approached temperature similar to a star, thus destroying the ark and in fact vaporizing all the water on the planet. She calls this the heat problem. She came to this conclusion based on known physics of today. So, for these creationists to be correct about the flood, they would also have the burden of showing that the known natural forces of today would have had to have been drastically different at that time. This is another whole layer of hypotheses for which they would have had to find supporting evidence. It's worth noting that several of the creationists who have addressed Erica's point have resorted to magical thinking, claiming that God can do anything, therefore he changed the rules. Sorry, but that doesn't float our boat. Okay, we're at the end. To those of you who made it all the way to the end, I thank you. I know this kind of video with its wall of words and no fun little memes to entertain us in between isn't to everybody's liking. But apparently a few of you seem to like it because a few of you actually do seem to want to watch my videos. I thank you for that very much. So if you actually did make it all the way to the end of the video, you must have liked it. And so please do give it a thumbs up, as well as leave a comment. I'd love to hear your comments. And again, if you haven't subscribed, now is a great time to do so. Do it now and you'll never have to think about it again. That's all. Have a wonderful day. Bye-bye.